Well, thanks for that introduction, Mike. I think we're going to get started. So hopefully you're in the right room. So today's session is about introducing the AIA's Re-occupancy assessment tool. And I'm your host, Chris Kiefer. And a bit about me. I work for Arup in San Francisco, and I'm a senior logistics consultant. So often a sub-consultant to architects for commercial developments around the Bay Area in California. And so what I tend to do is help do designs for freight delivery and waste management for both single buildings and for master plans. And so I'm also a licensed architect, and I also have a background in landscape architecture and worked as a planner for a number of years as well. And so, maybe some of you have worked with my firm. So, pleasure to meet all of you. And actually, in part of developing this presentation was as a local architect out of Oakland, Lester. He and I we co-developed this presentation for the San Francisco AIA a couple of months ago. And Lester cannot be with us today. Unfortunately, actually, he passed away recently. I just got notification just this morning from his family, and he actually had unfortunately contracted COVID-19. Actually, so we'll all miss Lester, and I think he would like us to continue with this presentation and spread the word. And I have a lot of his ideas captured here, so I'm going to be reading from some of Lester's notes as we go through this. He and I are both part of the National AIA Disaster Assistance Committee who developed this document. And Lester had a lot of experience with post-emergency disaster assessments, and so this one was just another emergency that he was responding to. Okay, so Mike, you mentioned that this is part of the continuing education series, and so folks on the call will be receiving 1.5 units of credit for this course, and this will also be made available as a recording for AIA East Bay members to view after the fact. And I'd like to just read this disclaimer here because it is a bit important, particularly for COVID-19 related issues. So information contained in this document is meant to serve as a helpful resource, but it should not be interpreted as legal or other professional advice. And due to the rapidly changing scientific, legal, and regulatory landscape related to COVID-19 outbreak, this document may at any time become out of date, and I'll point out a few examples of that as we go. So therefore, AIA does not guarantee its accuracy, and of course, the architects should know that you should contact your local government agencies and/or attorney in your location on current laws and seek advice about the appropriate licensed professional on custom strategies that meet your unique needs. And so you may notice that we've bolded rapidly changing here. So the virus just started in the past year, and there's lots of new scientific information coming out about that. And what we've tried to do through the Disaster Assistance Committee is create some guidance based on the latest scientific information, and some of that has changed, and will continue to change as well. And so this webinar, we're here to introduce the Re-occupancy assessment tool, and this is the AIA's recently published national guidance on how to reduce risk. And the purpose is to provide not only architects, but private clients, civic leaders about a general framework of strategies for reoccupying buildings and businesses. As we transition from being fully shut in our homes to being fully open, there is this transition point where we have different levels of opening. And so the purpose of this webinar is intended to familiarize local AIA members with the document's context, its approach, its organization, sources of information, highlight certain building interventions for discussion. Okay, so we have a few poll questions for this webinar, and this is going to be our first of 4 poll questions. And so the first poll question is, what is your primary reason for joining us today? And so, yeah, so Mike will be putting that on the screen. So choice A, I'm eager to learn about COVID-19 mitigation strategies. B, how to help find my firm and employees stay healthy through COVID-19. C, a client asked for our firm to help them create a reopening plan for their building. D, I'm here for the CEUs. Or E, other. So we'll just give it a couple
If you're
of
going to respond
minutes.
on other, it would be really great to just pop that answer into the chat as well. We'd love to know. Thank you.
So we'll give it a few more seconds here. So Mike, you can let me know when you think it's a good time to close the poll.
People have not voted yet, so let's encourage those 6 to get at it. Now it's 5. But we've had the poll open for a minute. Usually that's enough, so I'm going to go ahead and end it and share the results.
Okay, so it looks like the vast majority are here to learn about, are eager to learn about COVID-19 mitigation strategies. And that's very reassuring. And let's see, 18% to help my firm and employees stay healthy. Okay, so I think this content will cover both, and so we're going to go over examples of each of these things. So thank you very much for voting. And we're going to have a couple of those sprinkled throughout those polls. So here's our learning objectives. 1, to describe the elements of the document and their value for reducing risk. 2, enhance your understanding of this rapidly changing guidance. And you may be familiar with some of the sources already, but we're going to be talking about like what are the sources of information that we'll be looking forward, going forward. Number 3 is learn a methodology for applying what's called the hierarchy of controls intended to mitigate the spread of COVID-19. So I want you to just keep this in your mind, the hierarchy of controls. It's a pyramid shape, and so we'll be spending a few slides on that one. Number 4, we're here to apply checklists from the AIA's Re-occupancy assessment tool to develop interventions to your buildings and reduce the spread of COVID-19. And then finally, number 5, if time permitting, we may have an open discussion about which aspects of COVID-19 interventions may conflict with our other long-standing design aspirations. Okay, so for the next few minutes, we're going to actually start getting into the Re-occupancy assessment tool itself. So we're going to talk about how it's part of a recent suite of recently published guidance from the AIA. We're going to be talking about the context for this tool's development. We're going to be talking about what are the new features of this document since 1.0, the general conditions, and then get into what exactly is this document. So poll question number 2. So having a couple of quick ones here in the beginning, but I'd just like to know before I jump into the next sections is which AIA COVID-19 resources are you familiar with? I think a lot of us have been spending time reading things online, and so just get a quick sense about what we're familiar with here. So A is emerging research from public health data. B is the AIA's document for risk management plan for buildings. C is this re-occupancy tool itself. D is ArchMap, and E is the building type specific guidance. So we're getting some voters in here. Looks like a lot of folks so far are familiar with both public health data and the re-occupancy assessment tool. So that's it's good to know. Yeah, and I guess as we continue to vote, on the next slide we'll be talking about what these things are. But what's missing is this is choice A. There's a screenshot there, and that little graphic on the left is showing there's little gradients there showing humidity levels, I believe, where the virus has been found to thrive at both very high humidity levels and very low humidity levels. And then in this center zone, um, which basically overlaps with ASHRAE's guidance on relative humidity, is where luckily we find the virus thrives the least. Okay, so it looks like the polls are closed, and it looks like the most attendees are most familiar with the emerging research from public health data. So I think that is probably the best source of information and will probably continue to be. And the Re-occupancy tool itself both grabs information from those sources and puts it through an architectural lens and takes it one step forward about putting forward ideas about how we can mitigate that. So thank you for voting, everyone. Okay, and so I mentioned the suite of AIA resources for COVID-19, and I mentioned that I'm a part of this national committee that the AIA has for the Disaster Assistance Committee, and so these are some documents that have been put out recently: Risk Management Plan for Buildings, Re-occupancy Tool. ArchMap is really interesting. So this one, if you've had a project that you have been working on related to COVID-19, this is a portal where you can upload information about it, including if it's confidential. You're not forced to reveal the confidential aspects, but I think what the intent of that is everyone's trying to know what types of interventions are being put forward around the country. And so you can browse on this map and click on a state-by-state level and see what interventions have been done. So it's a really interesting site, and it's going to be a really good resource, I think, in the long term. And finally, the building type guidance. So the building type guidance is it's similar to the Re-occupancy assessment tool, but it does dive into detail on, like one would think, a certain building types. There's one on schools, there's one on senior living, there's one on offices, there's a building type guidance also on retail. And so it does dive into a bit of extra detail on those specifically, whereas the Re-occupancy tool itself, the one that we're talking about today, is more general in nature. Okay, and so who authored all these documents? I mentioned Disaster Assistance Committee. So this is a committee of folks here, you can see in the middle, come from all over the country, East Coast, West Coast, North and South. So represents various geographies, different climate zones, different regulatory environments. And so what you're finding here is this tool that is meant to apply to everyone across the country. And so here on the right, you can see the timeline of development. So it's the recording of this video. On March 20th, we had the first statewide lockdown. And then about a month later, we began work on version 1.0. And within a few weeks, we released that. And so following the release of 1.0, we also had versions 2.0 and 3.0 released in pretty short order. And actually, right now we're in August, late August 2020. And so version 3.0 was just released this month. And so I believe this is the first presentation in the country that goes over this specifically, some of the latest that's in this guidance. And so you may be wondering, well, what's coming next beyond this? We're still deciding about future updates. We're thinking that it may be a quarterly basis, maybe for the next year or some interval such as that. Stay tuned for that one. Okay, so so the new features since version 1.0 is this. So when you open the document, you'll find a lot of these symbols here and checklists. And let me just talk about to help you get oriented, and because if you're going to be working with clients, they may be looking at this as well. So originally we had a lot more checkboxes here, and we've simplified that on a point-by-point basis. There's essential and desirable, and this is something that the client understanding the client's own programmatic needs can help decide whether it's essential or desirable, and check this. And from there, the specific interventions, this can help inform that. Next is the symbology here, distinguishing among building types. So by default, where there's no symbol here, it's meant to be general, applies to all buildings in general. But besides that, we have education, office, restaurant, senior living, retail, and housing. And these, this breakdown here corresponds with the building type specific guidance that I mentioned a few slides before. So some of those, so there is some overlap here with that, but those obviously have more. Next is we did clarify the list of potential interventions here. You know, so these are the things. This is the actual content that does change from versions 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, and so on in the future. That this is the heart of the document itself, and we do attempt to clarify and make the language more clear, because the committee does receive questions nationally about clarifying this point or that point. So it is a work in progress. Another one I do want to point out, I know it's strange to talk about numbering, but this is really important. So this is kind of a hierarchical outline format. And what's great about this is that if you look at, let's say, 3.2.1, you'll find these in renderings and some of the other documents for cross-referencing. So those other documents do reference this one as a base. And we'll see this later. We do have some rendering examples, but I just want you to keep that in mind. You know, if you ever want to collaborate with someone else, it's sometimes it's easy to talk about, you know, a certain number there.
Chris, there's a couple of questions in the chat asking no hospitality or hotel category, and another person, Ben, asks about healthcare.
Okay, yeah, great questions. So I would say, to my knowledge right now, there's nothing on hospitality specifically. You know, in some ways, I would say the senior living may approach that, and the committee may eventually create a document for the hospitality building type. These were chosen, I think, by order of priority, thinking like who might need first some guidance. And so, yeah, hospitality isn't coming out per se, but you may be able to find some hospitality-like elements in senior living. Now, for healthcare, that's a very good question. So that is one that's missing, isn't it? I mean, a lot of what came out early was how to convert buildings into kind of makeshift healthcare environments. And there was a lot of work. There were a lot of consultants working nationally on converting those spaces. And I think the committee figured that there was enough, I guess, government oversight and enough people working on that where they have their own guidance kind of worked out. They had to do it first. And so a lot of that happened actually prior to the creation of this one. But that's something that I can also bring back to the committee if there's a real need for it ongoing, just to document maybe what's been done. That's certainly something we can look at to create a building-specific type one about healthcare. So yeah, thanks for those questions, Mike. I can't see the chat necessarily, so if any other questions come up, please do. Everyone on the call, please do feel free to continue putting those in the chat. Okay, so what is the re-occupancy assessment actually? It provides a general framework for approaching clients and civil leaders about what to do about our nationwide situation. And it's meant to provide potential strategies for mitigating the transmission of the virus in buildings. But I think one theme of this document here and one theme of this presentation is that it's not meant to be prescriptive per se, where you have to do this or have to do that. All of these buildings do have to be worked out on a case-by-case basis, but you know, the committee thinks that having a lot of interventions kind of, or a list of interventions geared towards architects can help build some ideas and be a good jumping off point. So what this is, you'll see on this diagram on the right, is that we did rely heavily on guidance from CDC, OSHA, the AIA, which is the American Industrial Hygienist Association, and then of course ASHRAE, which I think we all know. We hear a lot from ASHRAE about mechanical guidance. And so what you'll find in this document is that it's not just for, like, let's say, interior features. It's meant to be actually fairly comprehensive. So we have elements of site work, we have elements of programming, a little bit about structural work, and so there's something in here that it's meant to be comprehensive. And so, architects' roles in all this is, anything related to buildings, is that any kind of building intervention must be coordinated. And so architects do occupy a special spot here in coordinating. If there's any kind of mechanical intervention, it does have to correspond with the way that the layout is working. And so we don't want each of these organizations independently, thinking that this is just a mechanical problem, or it's just an interior partition problem. The interventions actually need to be coordinated, I think, is the point. Okay, and so this document, the Re-occupancy assessment tool, begins with this general condition. And what we're trying to do here is put forward these general parameters here. Let me move this out the way. So if the intended operation of the facility can't satisfy certain prerequisites, then the facility is likely not a good candidate for utilizing the following reopening considerations for minimizing the spread of COVID-19. And the below goals, operating authority, facility authority, and risk management categories are set forth as a baseline. And the facility under evaluation may have additional prerequisites that are unique to that. Now, in order to utilize various recommendations that will alter the physical building and site the business operator needs, the business operator needs to confirm their legal right to make such changes with the landlord and the appropriate authorities having jurisdiction. And this could affect the use of the public sidewalk, reduction of required parking spaces, building permits, when affecting the permanent construction of the building, and could also include compliance with ADA considerations. And earlier on in this presentation, I did mention how our other design aspirations could be affected by some of these. And something that's come out since the earlier versions of the Re-occupancy assessment tool is there has been feedback about making sure ADA considerations are put forward and kind of emphasized more in this document. And so that's something that that has been updated here. But it just goes to show that, yeah, there's a lot, some of these things that we normally have to contend with when altering buildings, they don't necessarily go away because this happens to be an emergency. So. Okay. I think I've already gone over this, the checklist format for symbols. And so the idea is that this is a PDF. It's kind of an interactive PDF, and so you can either print it off and fill it out by hand, or you can actually click on the checkboxes in there and use it as a tool, maybe some kind of charrette type tool when working with clients. Okay, so here is the CDC hierarchy of controls for COVID-19. And I want to spend a minute or two talking about this because it is, this whole document is kind of organized along along these guidelines here. And so let's talk about what that is. So normally when we talk about interventions, what you'll be reading in the news, we'll always be hearing about PPE, wearing masks, wearing gloves. According to the CDC, that's actually the least effective intervention that out there for this, because ideally you wouldn't be so close to the virus where you would need masks and goggles and and gloves to block it. Ideally, it wouldn't even be in the same environment with you at all. And so, according to the Centers for Disease Control, social isolation is the most effective way of doing this. Like if we can eliminate coming in contact with anyone with the virus, that would be number one. Secondly, if we can substitute for the virus, that would be better if like maybe one disease can substitute for another. It doesn't really, so these first two don't really apply to the situation. So in this document, you won't find any items related to these first two. But what we'll do find here is item number 3. They call it engineering controls. We kind of renamed that architectural and engineering controls here. You'll find a lot of items in this. That's really one of the main substance of this document here, is quite about that. And beyond architectural and engineering controls, we have these administrative controls, and these can manifest themselves with working from home or staggering schedules or processes for controlling flow in the building or policies for washing hands and cleaning up. And finally, when we come to the end, after all of these maybe have failed to keep us away from the virus, then finally the PPE is meant to be the last line of defense. And so that's something I do want to emphasize here. And so we added some stars here to denote their relative importance to architecture and construction. And I did mention that the number of items in this document are kind of listed here alongside those. When we gave this presentation last time, Lester wanted me to, he wanted to mention that this hierarchy of controls concept is fundamental to both the CDC and OSHA approaches. The concept assumes that administrative controls aren't effective as physical controls, and administrative controls are subject to human behavior, and the likelihood of instructions on how to behave is subject to an individual's understanding and willingness to comply, as seen from the ongoing controversy we see about wearing masks or not wearing masks. And also, there's policies, for instance, like, there was just something in the news this morning about cruise ships about, you shouldn't go out beyond a certain social bubble, and where someone deviates from that, it does cause a problem, and that's an administrative control. And then finally, a physical barrier or implement is a more positive means to accomplish an action of compliance. Okay, so the rest of this presentation does follow the CDC guidance, the hierarchy of controls, and the first two priorities, as I just mentioned or alluded to, that instituting social isolation and replacing the hazard don't necessarily apply to us in this case. And so for the first one, wherever possible, occupants should work or access the business from home, which is actually part of what we're doing right here as part of this streaming session. Normally we might be having this in the AIA East Bay office. And secondly, there is no available substitution for COVID-19 but this may become relevant for other diseases. So, maybe there will be future pandemics, for instance, measles and tuberculosis, has been found to be a lot more contagious than, let's say, COVID-19. And so, we might find that would be, that may apply in those situations, but not necessarily for COVID-19. Okay, so the third priority, architectural and engineering controls. So this will be a fairly lengthy section here. Maybe hopefully we're doing okay on time here. We're going to be talking about all these elements, everything from programming to space planning, plumbing and fixtures, finishes, site work. They all apply. There's something that can be done for COVID-19 in each of these categories, and that's what we're going to talk about. And once again, I just want you to remember that this is meant to be a framework, and so we're trying to introduce the concepts here. Okay, so first for programming, so we're going to, actually for all these slides, I just want to say that on the right side of the page, we have some screenshots directly from the document. And on the right side are just kind of simplified bullet points for these. It's not a one-for-one. So whatever we have here on the left-hand side of the page is just meant for this session only. But you'll find under each one of these, there could be quite a large amount of bullet points in some cases. So for instance, 3.1.1 is up here, but we also have 6 or 7 sub-bullets. So I just want you to keep that in mind. We did put an asterisk here to know where those conditions arise. So let's see, here we're talking about programming, adapting a space to meet public health goals, provide biophilic amenities that promote mental health and well-being, and then provide outdoor programming. So the repurposing of a building and outdoor spaces may include additional confirmations from the AHJs or the landlord, or even the city. We've had in the Bay Area cases where it's okay to eat outdoors for restaurants to have eating outdoors, and later times where that's actually rescinded. So is outdoor eating a permitted use? Some jurisdictions are waiving limitations, and some situations require a conditional use permit. If there is additional outdoor usable area, such as dining or sales, technically it could require a 2% max slope in all directions as per ADA. So sometimes, if we've seen how a car parallel parking spot on the street, the crown of the street, the cross slope, it may exceed this. And so that's something that an architect could consider, is is the slope of that outdoor environment, does it suit, would it suit people with disabilities? And will the use of exterior areas not originally intended for new use or operations on public property, will it still meet the liability insurance policies of the business? This is a question that the clients may have. And will new use of areas affect the occupant load and subsequent egress requirements of the building? This document won't necessarily give you answers to those questions, but in queuing up the framework here, these questions may arise when actually implementing some of these. So for space planning, something that's come up, I think pretty obvious for a lot of architects, are the density of the spaces, reducing the seating or the furniture layout. And also part of this, in space planning, there may be additional waste bins spread throughout. If in certain cases, if someone has to dispose of gloves or masks and moving from one space to another, there may need to be additional janitorial type elements here that need to be accounted for. And we also can consider one-way traffic flow in certain areas. And this is something that a lot of you on the call may have considered for your own spaces. Is it practical to do that? Ideally, we wouldn't be having people pass each other, if necessary. And then we can, one thing that came up during our sessions here was actually about expanding interior queuing spaces where we have to throttle the circulation. So if one-way flow is happening, or maybe if we have restricted elevator usage, people may be queued up at certain kind of choke points in the building, and so this would require some additional space for that queuing that may not be otherwise. And that goes with both indoor and outdoor. If folks are queuing up to come into the building, perhaps when leaving and using a taxi or rideshare, we would want to keep them fully separated. Okay, finally we get to an image. Sorry for all those bullet points there, but this is from the building type specific guidance here. So this is a sample classroom, and this came out of a national charrette, just showing what might a post COVID-19 classroom look like. And so talking about timing, this was done, I think, back in June or July. And now schools actually starting, public schools have started almost everywhere at this point. And we're finding that perhaps each school has found its own unique solutions here, but some of the things that we can see in here are the spacing of the desks, everyone facing in a certain direction. And it does give out this does imply a certain density here, 800 square feet, and you can count the number of students and people in this classroom. I can say that it's been difficult to pin down a single number for nationwide density. It does seem to change actually from school district to school district. And I know this scene here is something that local Bay Area school districts are thinking about very carefully. But what I do want to point out, though, is you'll notice these numbers here. These correspond with the numbers in the re-occupancy assessment tool. So if you do access that building type guidance, that's what it's cross-referencing.
Hey, Chris, we have a question from, I think it's pronounced EHI. How do these guidelines affect allowable occupancy?
How do these guidelines affect allowable occupancy?
Mm-hmm.
I guess could you clarify? Sorry, allowable occupancy.
Well, I'm going to let EHI speak. So EHI, I've unmuted you.
Go ahead.
Maybe he stepped away.
Okay. Well, sorry about that. Well, I can say this. Like some of the. Oh, was someone there?
Yes, this is Ehi. I'm sorry. Apologies for the. I had a little technical difficulty there. If you can hear me now.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to clarify that the question was, obviously with occupancy loads in buildings, nightclubs, whatever, we used to have, whatever the densities were in each jurisdiction. Is AIA going to come out with new requirements for densities now?
That's a really good question. I'm not certain about what their plans are. I would probably, the best thing I could do is would say check. Have you checked this school building type guidance document? It might have some information in there about it.
No, I don't have that document. I'm sorry.
Okay, so there is a URL in case you want to look it up during this call. So it's aia.org/safer buildings, I believe. So safer-buildings, and it may have some guidance in there. What I can say for this re-occupancy assessment tool and some of these other documents that I've helped work on, sometimes density is put forward as like just a way of highlighting a certain scenario. These aren't meant to be prescriptive where you have to abide by these per se. But perhaps the AIA may think they want to issue guidance in the future. So sorry, that's the best I can answer for the moment. But thanks for that question.
Not a problem. Thank you.
Okay, so we do have another poll question here. So this will be our third, fourth poll question. So what types of projects do you work on actually in your practice? And this isn't necessarily COVID-19, but this is maybe in normal times, whether you work on mainly commercial or retail or schools, senior living or housing, or maybe something else. So we'll give it about close to a minute here to let everyone respond. Okay, I don't know if you can see the poll on my shared screen, but what I'm seeing is I'm seeing a lot of other here. Okay, it looks like looks like the polls are closed, and so we have 50% wins with other, followed by commercial, then retail, then schools, or actually multifamily and then schools.
A couple people did add in the other that were dropped into the chat. So those will also be shared with the group, as well as the link to this video afterwards.
Great, thanks, Mike. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide here. So we're not quite with the halfway point of this slide deck yet, but I think we still have quite a bit of time. So next section is we're talking about non-structural partitions. And one thing that we wanted to realize was in the beginning was that we have this idea about separating the exits from the entrance. Earlier on in the pandemic, there was a lot of uncertainty about how it was transmitted, and in fact, there still is uncertainty about how it's transmitted. But in the beginning, there was kind of two modes that we were considering for all this. One is through airborne transmission, and the other one is through touch. The medical term, I think we'll talk about it later, is fomites, where people brushing past each other coming in and out of the building, may have aided to spread the building. To spread the disease. And so we're thinking that this goes along with one-way flow that we talked about earlier, considering exits separate from entrances. And we also wanted to create, emphasize that this idea about creating touchless modes of travel as much as possible. And this includes anything from doors to soap dispensers to waste baskets. The less that we touch, then the less we can spread is the idea. And then finally, install drive-through and/or pickup service windows. This is something that's more commercial in nature. Of course, we're seeing a lot of that, with especially like the food service restaurants. The ones who have drive-through windows, may end up doing more businesses than the ones that rely more heavily on coming inside to eat. And so it's been an event to see how the businesses adapt or struggle through that. And so as part of this, one thing I did want to mention as well about this entrance and exit is security. It's one of those design ideals that that we do need to maintain, especially for certain building types. Like, how does this kind of intervention affect security? That's something that you may need to work on with your clients to see, does this new flow, how does it impact your security strategy for the building? Okay, so next is signage. So this is about posting hygiene and cleaning signages, throughout your building and maybe in the front window of the building. And if you do have a special flow pattern, like we're mentioning the one way, there needs to be signage to help support that. I can say at my firm, we've done some special we have this pedestrian modeling software. And so we've been simulating how might people react to some of these interventions, where people are meant to flow in a certain pattern. And maybe when they first walk in, they won't be aware of that and, maybe going the wrong way. But there's also like a behavioral inertia factor here where, I've been going into a building for years a certain way, and it's difficult to change that. What we might find is after a couple of weeks, and there could be literal cutting of corners in the way, people are supposed to move through a space if there's no wall there to really physically block them from going in that direction. So the repurposing of spaces and new rules as to use the space, it can be confusing. So informational signage is particularly important. And so we can consider the cultural and language appropriate signage. The use of graphic representations of desired actions may at times be more appropriate than extensive text. Similar to this presentation, ideally, more visuals rather than text, can be absorbed faster, of course. And signage may need to meet the requirements of the California Building Code, Chapter 11, particularly where tactile or braille is required. and consider the use also on that point, how to incorporate instruction materials that's appropriate for the blind. Proximity activated audio units are relatively inexpensive and will also apply to all users. You know, Lester did have a number of key insights about these topics here, regarding the blind and disabled. Okay, so plumbing and plumbing fixtures. So we do have an image on the next slide about for restrooms, but so it's still uncertain about how COVID-19 is transmitted in restrooms. There was a study for SARS-1 in Hong Kong. There was a study about a trap that had dried out, and the idea is that through the waste coming through the toilets, that the virus may be present in the waste, and so would the venting of the restroom spaces, you know, may be in effect here. So part of what this document tries to show here is in a commercial space, particularly, and in schools, if the toilet lids could be installed enclosed, like when the toilet is flushed, like that's one thing that's helpful. We also this will come later in the mechanical section, but you know, we'll be talking about you know, air return, air supply, air returns, yeah, above each of the stalls would be an ideal scenario. And something that's in here on 3.5.2 that I want to point out, for buildings that have been actually closed for quite a number of weeks, the potable water systems is something that does need to be flushed. So the idea, we all know that, you know, the water in the United States is chlorinated, but how long is that chlorination effective for? You know, it does need to actually be moving through the system. That chlorination isn't effective forever, and so you know, there is a certain threshold beyond which, you know, whether it's days or a number of weeks before reoccupying, this is something that the facility maintenance team could work to flush out. Okay, so this rendering is from the AIA's Reopening America Strategies for Safer Offices, and it demonstrates numerous examples of interventions for plumbing fixtures in conjunction with signage, procedures, and HVAC. And so ASHRAE recommends having a high air supply with exhaust fans over each water closet, and air ideally enters the toilet compartment low to the ground and then exhausts directly above. Positive pressure positively pressurize the area outside of the toilet, and negative pressure within the toilet room itself. You know, it's something that consider. So like when folks open the restroom door, you know, that air is kind of being pulled into the space rather than coming outward. And so the toilet partition manufacturers are now making full height compartments as a response to the unisex group toilets that would make actually capturing and directing air per ASHRAE possible. And next, we want to consider dividing multiple fixture toilet rooms into single occupancy, all gender accessible toilets, or consider this an initial new construction. You know, so I think one thing that it's uncertain at this point in time in August 2020 about what are the permanent long-term effects of this? You know, if the pandemic clears up by the end of the year, will everything move back to business as usual? Or are there permanent changes that will be coming out that would make buildings more resilient towards maybe another COVID-19 outbreak or other airborne type outbreaks? You know, this is something that's still uncertain at this time. But when planning, you know, in the planning stages of new construction, this is definitely something I think everyone is considering at this time. And finally, I think when we talk about lower occupancies, or perhaps even blocking off certain toilets, you know, you may see some guidance about having every other toilet stall kind of like locked. to help reduce the density, simultaneous occupancy of a restroom space. This kind of intervention would need to be discussed with the AHJs, but calculations can be made to estimate as the occupancy of the building goes down. Perhaps the number of fixtures can go down temporarily as well. That's the takeaway. Okay, so we have here 3 slides of mechanical and passive ventilation. And I think this is where a lot of the discussions about buildings is centered on, about the ventilation idea. Now, in the context of the conversations that I've been a part of, or the talks that I've heard as well, you can think of the outdoor environment as being the best case and ideal, where you have infinite dilution, and full ventilation. And so one of the themes of mechanical of this section here is perhaps how can the building most replicate an outdoor environment. What you'll find here is a lot about increasing natural ventilation with possible, increasing the air changes, if there's operable windows, using those kinds of things. But of course it's highly dependent on what the building is, of course. But the idea is that the more fresh air that we have, then the more the virus, if it is airborne, the more it can be diluted. There is a theory about infection of this virus, and there's a theory about that it takes a certain quanta of virus for someone to become infected. Is it just one? Is it just one virus that will have us be infected, or is it 100? Does it take 1,000? This is uncertain. Nobody knows the answer yet. And there's papers coming out about about studies and making reasonable conclusions from this, but it hasn't been set yet. But how do we?
Chris, there's a question.
Yes.
And I think it's from Catherine Gutierrez, maybe. Anyhow, the question is, why would you need to block every toilet stall if the partitions went to the ceiling? And wouldn't this lead to men's restrooms being redesigned to be like women's, and we can create more privacy for men in the restrooms? ? Speaking of mother of a son, how daunting a men's restroom can be.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so maybe I can just go back for a second. So restrooms are restroom layouts are, I think, have experienced one of their greatest changes in the past few years, especially the movement, like the distinction between men's restrooms and women's restrooms versus the context of unisex restrooms. You're right. If the partitions went from floor to ceiling, or if it was a single occupancy type restroom, then perhaps some of these others wouldn't apply. Now, perhaps the takeaway here from this question is to point out is that maybe one type of intervention may be either incompatible with another, or perhaps they're redundant. That is a good point. That in some cases, if it's redundant, you may not need to throw the kitchen sink and all of these items at the problem. If one of these interventions really solves it, then I would say that's something you can go with. So I hope that kind of answers that question. Okay. Okay, so back to the mechanical portion. So this one idea about monitoring of the space, monitoring relative humidity, temperature, and CO2 levels to identify and resolve issues. I know in conversations in my firm, there's an idea about can CO2 be an analog for gauging how much virus may be potentially there in the space. The idea is that there is a background level of CO2 in the outside environment where we all live. And indoors, there's a higher level of CO2 because, when there's occupants in there, they're breathing. And so the idea is that the more CO2 there is, then the more, human breath that may be comprising the air. One interesting thing to note with filters is that CO2 does not get filtered as part, when we talk about later MERV 13 and HEPA and everything, that, CO2 is a molecule that it still is part of the air, even moving through those filters. And so the more CO2 that's in a space, and if it can be monitored, then the more you can expect that would be human breath. And so does that equate? That's something that does need further study. Okay, so the second of 3 slides about the mechanical ventilation. We have some things in here about this idea about flushing the building before occupancy and after occupancy in the evening and afternoon. One thing about this one here about flushing was that earlier on in the literature for COVID-19, there were studies coming out about how long can COVID-19 exist on a surface, whether it's cardboard, plastic, wood, metal, and so on, and how long can it linger in the air? And if it does linger in the air, how long can the virus actually survive in the air? Even though there are some studies that say it can last on a certain surface, it doesn't necessarily manifest itself in reality in the same way. But the idea is that, to be on the safe side, flushing could occur as part of the building maintenance regime during the pandemic. The idea is that when folks come in the morning, they can be reasonably assured that the virus wasn't lingering in the air overnight. Now, there's nothing to say that that's something that does occur now, but that just goes to show that some of these items in here, may be considered on the cautious side. Now, the next one is about the relative humidity levels. So this is following ASHRAE, preferably within a relative humidity of 40 to 60%. And in the document itself, I don't know if you can see this as well as I can on my screen, but you'll see in red here these footnotes. These footnotes, you can always look up the source of information from which many of these were derived. And this one I do know does come from ASHRAE, and this is their general guidance in typical situations, but also studies have been shown to find that the virus does not necessarily like these mid-range humidity levels, but they find that they're more prevalent at the above 60% and more prevalent below 40%. Okay, so I want to talk about, for this one, this idea of ultraviolet light, UVGI, or sometimes it's actually acronymed as GUVI. So this stands for ultraviolet germicidal irradiation, the way this is spelled here. And it's an interesting technique that I'd like to point out. So it's about using UV light, and like the intense kind of light that may, that may give us sunburns when we're outside. And it's using this ultraviolet light to sterilize the air. And this could lend itself readily to retrofit situations for buildings. UV can be custom installed out of sight in an air handler or a duct, or it can be part of light fixtures that are facing upward. And that would require a lighting specialist, I think, to work on with that. Or UV light can be part of these portable robot-like cleaning machines that are used to supplement janitorial services to efficiently sterilize spaces. And we see these kinds of machines actually already in certain airplanes, public buses, and high-end hotels, where there'll be a machine kind of wheeled into the center of a room, everyone will leave the room, and that room will be blasted with a kind of intensity ultraviolet light. And the idea is that the light can rupture the cell or the membranes or the walls of the virus itself, and so it's a way to help sterilize the environment. And so besides these kind of standalone machines as a janitorial type supplement, they can be installed into ductwork, and it's a really interesting solution that you may consider for your buildings. Now there is this bullet point here I just want to point out is there are different kinds of ultraviolet light, ultraviolet A, B, and C, and consider using ultraviolet C during non-occupied hours for sterilization. And the idea is that other ultraviolet wavelengths will break apart oxygen molecules and create ozone. And ozone is something that is, as many of you may know, is something that we shouldn't be breathing in, and we shouldn't be creating more of it purposely. So ultraviolet C, has been highlighted to show that you can have the sterilization without the side effects of the ozone. Okay, so that kind of covers the mechanical ventilation portion, and I know we could have hours-long sessions just on that topic. But once again, this re-occupancy assessment tool is meant to be to cover a lot of all the different areas of the building. So I guess we're going to keep moving here from mechanical into electrical. And so this idea that on the topic of transmission through touch, how can we have occupants moving through buildings without having to touch a lot of things along the way and having everyone touch like the same button or the same surface? This page will give some suggestions here. Using sensors, automated controls. There's some ideas for maybe having voice or mobile phone actuated controls. And as a possibility, elevator manufacturers have designed control systems that are foot operated, actually, which are originally designed to meet the needs of accessibility and wheelchair foot operation. And the elevator is the required accessibility mode of travel within multi-story buildings. And some voice or mobile phone operation, it may not be appropriate for occupants with certain kinds of disabilities. I can say that through some of the struts that I had worked on, that I was a part of, there were a lot of well-intentioned solutions put forward about the elevator only going to certain floors, and if you want to go to a different floor, maybe it'll only stop at every third floor or something, and then people walk downstairs. Well, from an accessibility standpoint, a lot of those will preclude the movement to a certain floor, and so it's something we definitely want to be mindful of for that. For the foot operated controls, I do know of an example where I live in Berkeley. The Berkeley Public Library does have those touch controls in there on their elevators right now. So. Okay, next section is appliances, equipment, and accessories. So for this one, it may be possible to have body temperature detection devices incorporated into existing security checkpoints, particularly if there's an employee already monitoring this area. However, the HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act compliance for confidentiality regarding health conditions must still be considered, and some form of privacy should be available in the temperature check zone that is monitored. So have procedures in place if a possible infected person also is detected that will not be a public spectacle. So I think what that what we mean by that is think about in airports, the TSA. There's inspection points in front of everyone. Everyone's moving through the same line, but there's options for private screening as well. When employers and businesses enact these kinds of mitigation measures. Privacy concerns is something that we'll see coming up nationally. But I think the idea for this document, though, is that once again, touchless is a theme, and physical distancing also, of course, is a theme. Okay, after the slide for finishes and furnishings, we do have a rendering to see for an open office. For this section, this is one that we may not hear a lot from let's say ASHRAE and the mechanical engineers about installing physical barriers such as plastic partitions and sneeze guards. We have seen this actually manifest itself over the past few months. I think everywhere we go commercially, we see these in quite a number of places. Replace or modify restroom stalls and partitions to make the partitions floor to ceiling. And actually, the question a few minutes ago was about this topic. And so sometimes in this document, we can see certain sections overlap. And next, what I have bolded here is enhance acoustic treatment so occupants can be heard through their masks. I personally find this something that's needed for me, that it's where the business requires verbal discussions. It can be difficult if there's equipment going in the background plus the muffling of the masks. So so this is something that can be done to help enhance adherence to the rules. How often do we see where everyone pulls down their masks to speak? Now, if there's acoustics that can support that, we may see a greater compliance. Studies have shown as part of this work that there's a theory that the more someone is projecting their voice, whether talking on the phone, giving a webinar, singing perhaps, that the more quanta of virus that may be projected from their mouths through there. And so this discussion on barriers and partitions is highly contextual, obviously. In retail points of transaction, we do see these sneeze guards, and this may or may not be helpful in certain situations like offices where people may linger for many hours. And let's look at an image to see what we mean by that. So this rendering is from the AIA document, Reopening America: Strategies for Safer Offices. It demonstrates an illustration of interventions in the realm of fixtures and furnishings. So we see partitions here. We see some people, but not all people, wearing masks here. We see the spaces kept distant. But the interesting thing about this kind of topic is that if you can imagine someone sitting here at their office speaking on the phone, and let's say if they are infected, the idea is that their breath will start to fill up this area and extend outward. And so, some later studies that I know we've been doing in my firm, where there's computational fluid dynamic studies just showing that the actual movement of the air shows that sometimes where folks linger a long time, such as this, that the partitions may not be effective. So full-size cubicles, for instance, if you're going to be there all day long, may not be that much more effective than an open office. So this is something that we may be seeing changing over time. And when we gave this presentation with the AIA San Francisco, Les wanted to note that although the desk workers are behind screens, he's echoing what I was just saying. Expect new recommendations that indicate they should all wear masks, even when they're kind of screened off. And ASHRAE indicates that airflow and filtering directly inhibit atmospheric pathogens, and using higher volumes of outside air and at least 6 air changes per hour is desirable. Incorporation of UVC lights in the ductwork also has a benefit of being an existing technology, and it can also avoid the eye damage and it kills rather than just captures or filters the virus. All this suggests that there will be an increase in energy use that building owners must understand. And I know we've passed the mechanical section here, but let's just talk about that for a second. When we're talking about changing economizers, bringing in a lot more outside air, that may actually may not be as bad in the Bay Area with, or versus in a place like, let's say, Florida, for instance, with high humidity. But in all, we'll find that that would actually reduce energy efficiency. So some of these points, to react to the pandemic may be at odds with sustainability. And that's something that, when we talk about how is this going to work out in the long run, will there be a permanent change? It's still up in the air to see. I think we're all interested to see how pandemic responses can find their way to become alongside all the other resiliency best practices that we know. Okay, so now that we've discussed inside the building, we're going to talk about site work for a second. We mentioned earlier about the reconfiguration of, let's say, parking. If there's some spaces that they're moving towards the outdoors. The reconfiguration of parking spaces must account for accessibility needs as well. The spaces most convenient for pickup service may also be the spaces that are most necessary for accessible parking and the accessible path of travel into the building. And entry and egress doors may also be suitable for retrofitting with power operators commonly available for accessibility that include foot operation to avoid hand contact. And also consider the predominant wind directions and choose an appropriate queuing area. So let's look at this of a commercial space, a small grocery. This is from the AIA's document, Reopening America, Strategies for Safer Retail Stores. It demonstrates examples of interventions beginning outside of the building envelope. So, sometimes we might think that all the interventions have to start the building envelope, but it actually can start on the site. In the Bay Area, I know we've all seen at the supermarkets, a certain level of queuing as they throttle the amount of density that's inside the building. And so how well do these businesses manage the queue that sometimes actually goes beyond their own property line? Those kinds of issues can be hard to contend with. But one thing that we were mentioning here is that if the queuing area is affecting, accessible parking, well, that's something that has to be considered. We can't encroach on those accessibility rights. So the takeaway is that, just remember that these interventions don't necessarily end with the building envelope, but go on to the entire property as well. Whew, okay, so I think we have about 15 minutes left or so in this presentation, and I just want to say congratulations for making it this far. That was a huge section we just went through. All of that stuff until now was the third priority, the architectural and administrative controls. And according to the CDC, those can be more effective from a public health perspective at reducing the transmission of the virus than these later ones that we're talking about, which will be administrative controls, and then finally PPE, which comes afterwards. And so in this section of the document for administrative controls, there's policies, and there's various kinds of procedures to reduce the spread of human contact through human transmission through fomites, and also procedures to support physical distancing. So we'll have basically one slide for each of these. So policies include, it's a range of things like developing emergency communications plan, providing up-to-date training, identifying and accommodating occupants in the CDC-defined higher risk health categories. And with these policies, they can be challenging to implement. For any business that's been open and operating in a certain way for many years, I mentioned this before, there's this certain inertia that everyone wants to revert back to the old ways of doing things. There's some muscle memory there. And it takes some discipline actually to stick with these procedures because sometimes they can be inconvenient or somewhat complicated, or they could be less efficient, physical movements, and they can be frustrating for certain certain people to adhere to over time. So that discipline is something that the building operator will have to monitor and help enforce. But as designers, as architects, it's something to take into account that we can't necessarily rely on policies in the same way like we can for the previous ones. And so one thing I want to emphasize is that it does take discipline to maintain these procedures, and it does take strong leadership and support from the very top of the organization to maintain. And that's something that we've discovered in some of our various pedestrian modeling exercises that we've had for different types of clients. That one type of client was more impatient, if you will, and maybe the rules don't necessarily apply to them when they find that they've actually executed something. Okay, so procedures to reduce the spread of person to person. So it's all about establishing a protocol. Is there a holding area in your building if someone is found to be symptomatic? And is there a procedure for safe transport? I can tell you this: one thing that's changed from the earlier documents is that it was discussing if someone has been confirmed, like while they're in your building, been confirmed to have the virus, and this has been changed to someone who's just simply symptomatic. Because earlier on in the pandemic, I think we were expecting there would be a lot more widespread and easy to access testing. Maybe it's something that everyone would have in their building's medical kit, like with the Band-Aids and the aspirin, but it's something that really hasn't come out yet. So, if someone is symptomatic, but no one's ever sure if they actually have it or not, can they go to a holding area until something can be done, until they can be picked up? And so this is a 3-part slide here, and this first one, like I said, does assume that there's testing in your building, and we're in full summer right now. But as we move into the fall and winter, there may be suspicion around, no one can distinguish between a cold, like a normal cold, or maybe the normal flu once fall begins. And so there may be a lot more need for folks, wanting to go to a certain holding area if they're feeling under the weather. And similar to the previous slide, there was something in here about encouraging participants to participate in contact tracing. And this would be nice to have contact tracing in place, although this hasn't necessarily materialized in the way that we might have been expecting, 4 or 5 months ago. But cell phones and other apps, may have the potential to assist with this. And on-site screening, may or may not be forthcoming as well. We have learned a lot about asymptomatic cases and transmission. And granted, these kinds of things may be costly to implement. Some kind of, and what we're talking about here is this entrance screening system. The smaller businesses, it may be out of the question that they could handle something like that. Who would manage it? Who would be monitoring that? This is something that does come up. Okay, so to reduce the spread of person to person, the word cohorting has entered the lexicon, I think, of all of us during this year, and it's something that we're seeing implemented now, and it's being considered for schools, senior living, and workplaces. And cohorting also corresponds with designing for lower densities. And here's an image from the senior the AIA document for safe senior living communities, and it demonstrates examples that may reduce the spread of pathogens. And here we're seeing fewer tables than this space might normally have otherwise had. And there are other details that may be too small for you to read here, things related to the bartender area. And so this one probably does need to be updated as well, because you can see in the renderings, not everyone is necessarily wearing a mask here. Now, fomites is something that was emphasized a lot more heavily in version 1.0 versus 3.0. And this is a two-part slide here, and you know, consider having operational breaks during business hours to allow for extra cleaning and waste removal that may not be part of your everyday workflow. And also another example of some of these interventions being at odds with sustainability is, you know, providing disposable towels and disinfectant as opposed to reusable ones. You know, is something that we've been seeing coming up. So I'm going to jump ahead to this rendering here and talk about. This is a kitchen and office space. This is from the Safer Offices guidance. And let's think about our offices. There's coffee pots, microwave, refrigerators, and the dilemma of working in an office again. Can workers eat a hot lunch that they bring? That would involve going to get a bowl, going to get a microwave, to the microwave, pressing the button, getting a fork, touching all of these surfaces. Is that possible? Or is it safer for them to go eat outside, to go through the elevator into an outside business? It's of course dependent on the context of the city and the environment, but this is something that you can find in this document here to help one can tackle that. Okay. So I think in the interest of time, I see I've probably been going a bit more slowly than I should have. I'm going to go to the next slide here. We already talked about queuing and accommodating other modes of personal transportation. You know, this does affect our density and does affect the spaces that we use outside. So I want to put up our final poll question to make sure everyone is still awake. I hope I haven't put everyone to sleep here with this presentation so far. But we want to know, like, what COVID-19 work have you done? Everyone on the phone, for your practice, what kind of work have you done here? Have you advised on alternate care site selection? Have you created a reopening plan for your client? Have you provided space planning services or retrofitted a building? We want to know.
We'd love to see any of the other answers get into the chat as well, please.
Okay, I think we're getting some good responses here. Keep it open for a few more seconds. Okay, the polls are in. So I think what leads this category is the other. So I'm interested to hear what that is. The second place by provided space planning services to accommodate physical distancing guidelines. And third is advised on alternative care sites selection and or retrofit. So, so Mike, are you able to see any of the other category?
Sure. Layla said no COVID work for us yet. Antonia said other, none for us. Robbie said C, D, and E, and none of the above. So nothing specific that wasn't on your list as far as the topic.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for responding there and staying with me this far. So this is we're getting down to the last section here. So the last section is about PPE policies, procedures, and then the equipment itself. You know, for PPE, you know, if it's a large facility, there's advice to centralize distribution of the PPE and then also have it secured. It can help manage inventory. It can help keep, you know, pilfering to a minimum. So that's something to keep in mind there. The businesses should train workers on the proper use of PPE. And for the PPE itself, I think it's something that everyone is very familiar with, something that's most widely discussed nationally. So about gloves, goggles, face shields, providing masks or cloth face covering. So these are all things that I think we're all familiar with. I just want to emphasize also that even though these are very effective on a person by person basis, in the CDC's list, hierarchy of controls, that this one is like the last line of defense when everything else has kind of not worked necessarily. Okay, so with a few minutes left, I just want to talk about these kind of social distancing diagrams. If you've been able to find the Re-occupancy assessment tool, I've been looking at it during this presentation. I remember I've gotten some questions about the diagrams in there, and I just want to show you that. I just want to clarify something, that if you were to just look at the diagrams and not read the text, you might think that one thing is being proposed. But over here, so when we talk about the distancing diagrams, we have a 6-foot radius, and then when there's two people, there's kind of like, it kind of manifests itself this way, and so it's where the people are still actually 6 feet apart, even though the circles may overlap a bit. Now, these two on the left are not in the document, but the right three are in the document. And this middle one is just simply showing that if the floor layout, if the folks are too close, this doesn't work if there has to be kind of a through travel path in between them. We want to keep them apart. So that's the difference between these two here. And so finally, the document also does have one for a more complex situation about showing the spacing that's required if you do have interior circulation. So I just wanted to clarify that. We had a lot of questions about that when we released 1.0 of this document. And if there's any time, maybe we can open up the audio here. We're kind of reaching the end, kind of reaching the end of my slide deck. We can talk about if there's any comments or questions about any kind of like thoughts about long-term changes to buildings. I'm very interested in this topic about, changes to lobbies, office spaces, workstations, schools, hotels, anything like that. I know some folks might have to drop off at 1:30, but if folks do want to stay on, I'll be available, and Mike will be as well to stay on and have a discussion. Also, just want to remind you that in this PDF version, these are the AIA list of resources, and there's a lot of great resources here, even beyond this. But these are hyperlinked also, so you can jump directly there if you have access to this PDF. And actually, that brings us to the end. I just want to thank you for sticking with me this whole time and listening through this. And thanks for the questions and the chat and the verbal questions until now. So I really appreciate it. So so thank you very much. Mike, would you? I don't know if the lines are muted or if anyone else wants to speak up or.
A couple of things. One is continue to put your questions into the chat. We can read those to Chris. And then once I go ahead and mute everybody, you're going to mute yourself. You're not going to be talking. That way we won't get any background noise. So we got a question from Ben. Any thoughts on how you might be building codes? How might the building codes be addressing COVID-19 related design challenges, and consider adopting some of these guidelines in the future updates? Code development is extremely long and a complex process.
Yeah, I think that's the big one. I mean, I'm highly interested in this topic. The code, the general building codes, I think tend to operate like on a three-year cycle. And I have read that the International Codes Committee, I think, was just had something out earlier in the summer or the spring calling for applicants to be part of the next round of codes development and revision. Yeah, it would just be pure speculation to see how that works out, but I think it will be necessary. I'll be surprised if we didn't see something there about how to respond to this. We might, and same thing for ASHRAE, in the ASHRAE 90.1, 90.2, those kinds of guidance documents which are referenced by the code, or perhaps maybe everyone forget. I mean, if it cleared up right away, hopefully, the lessons could be carried forward, for the next pandemic.
Ehai asks, what are your thoughts on things like stadiums and nightclubs, and will those be impacting the design codes?
Yeah, great question. Earlier in one of our charrettes, there was an architect, and we're developing these documents. There was an architect who was specializing in sports stadiums, and there were some diagrams that were there that I saw that were really interesting. So there's different ways of, let's say if it's a 50,000 person stadium, how can the density be reduced? Assuming that it would be reduced, and still have these activities take place. Would I know for Major League Baseball, maybe they're having the games and just filming them on TV and not having anyone in the stands. Or could certain sections be occupied, or could every other seat be staggered, or could every other row be staggered? There's a few different ways to do it to at least achieve a certain target. Now, whether the stadiums, would still be able to make a profit or not, that's something that would be part of the business case for that. But that's something that I've seen until now. They have to work it out, either on a state-by-state level or local-by-local. Locale level. We see it not just for sporting events, but also for things like, political rallies and that kind of thing. It's something that everyone needs to be mindful of. And I think that usually they weigh in at the local level in that. Now, secondly, for nightclubs, now this is one that I know we've been reading about super spreader type events at like bars and nightclubs that have opened early, back, I think, in the month of like June and July. Florida comes to mind once again, where maybe they were opening a bit early, and then I would find that those kinds of places, would be the source of an event. Now, one thing I did mention earlier is that there's a paper out where tracing what do these super spreader events have in common, and they seem to be focusing on the amount of speaking or singing or shouting that's occurring in these places. When we think about nightclubs, there's a lot of talking, and if there's dancing, there's a lot of breath happening. And when someone's infected, the more breath you put out, then the more infectious it becomes in theory. And so, what to do about that? Where the occupancy is so dense, that's a really tough one to tackle. Yeah, I'm not sure. And it's also uncertain about how does the ingesting of alcohol affect the transmission of that for someone who's infected.
Layla has a pretty important question that has to do with liability. They've got a number of projects ready to go to plan check. If our client is not interested in updating her COVID, are there any liability issues the AOR should be concerned about?
Yep, super important question. On every topic, it's always at the top of any architect's mind about liability, and always have to give the number one answer. That of course I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not. I can't really say with certainty for that. But I think it could tie into the question first of what are the local plan checkers, like what's their feedback in terms of if there's something specific they want to see. I think it's too fast to see, maybe to expect that there would be regulatory changes necessarily, like permanent regulatory changes that would be a clear, that the architect would clearly violate. That's a tough one, and I think that's what that was a bit of the genesis, I think, of maybe why the AIA wanted to start putting out documentation like this. Sometimes these issues are in the context of what would other architects do in a similar situation as a kind of a yardstick for did someone have an error or an omission here, or the standard of care. I would look to that of like what are the other architects doing in those kinds of situations. And I'm sorry, I can't give any more guidance than that. I think we're all waiting to see for that. But hopefully documents from the AIA such as this that if it's trying to show that at least it was put forward to that certain kinds of, that the architect put forward, maybe in the client's hands, certain kinds of documents are saying that at least these kinds of ideas or recommendations exist to the owner, I think that would be part of the paper trail and process that would be beneficial. That's a really good question, and you may have a follow-up, or someone else may have another question about that, but that is a tough one.
No other questions in the chat. Anyone else in the room want to unmute themselves and ask Chris a question?
Oh, hi, this is Teresa. I have a comment in regards to that liability. It's probably best for us all to be consulting our E&O insurers on issues like that, since it's such new territory for us all. They probably, their attorneys, I'm sure, have ideas on how best to approach that. Like, even probably they can give you, what notes you might want to include on your documents around it. So that's my suggestion.
Yep, that's a great point. Yep, you're absolutely right.
Hey, Chris, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
One point I wanted to throw out there for thought is, as architects, should we be thinking more about trying to prevent COVID or the infection from coming into the building as opposed to how it acts once it's in the building? I know that it's impossible to 100% prevent it from coming in the building, but are there procedures, design ideas that we should be thinking about to prevent things from coming in, like screening at the door, making sure temperatures are taken, things like that, as opposed to trying to change the way the building is designed internally?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I would, going back to that hierarchy of controls, the elimination, substitution. Yeah, so in this document, something we did go over is that there were some items here and there in this re-occupancy assessment tool about health checks, where it's feasible to implement those. So that is one thing. And I think some of the ideas around reducing the density of the building, where there's fewer people coming into the building, in some ways indirectly, that does, if there's half the people coming into the building, then maybe it lessens the chance of the virus coming into the building. Probably a lot of that would be in the policies framework, actually, now that I'm processing this question. That would be the fourth one, just above PPE, policies and procedures. There's like some time-based separation where maybe if someone is coming, let's say, to a school or office every other day, perhaps on their day off, they may start to feel symptomatic, and give them a break where they're not coming in necessarily every day, but during that day at home, it could give them time to identify that they have symptoms and avoid coming into that building that day. Hope those are a few useful minor examples there.
All right, any other questions from the group? If not, we can go ahead and wrap it up.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for staying on. These are great questions. I really appreciate the feedback. I know it's a lot to sit through for almost 2 hours here, but thank you so much for listening, and please feel free to reach out to me or to Mike. Maybe there can be some more AIA East Bay follow-on discussions about this topic. So wish everyone a great day, and stay healthy and safe out there.
Thanks, Chris. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Chris.
Bye. Thank you,
Everyone.